Good evening, everyone. I think we can start. First of all, I would like to start by saying that there is a live transcript box on the bottom right that you can tick in case you would like to use live captioning. Thank you for joining us tonight for the first talk in the Curatorial Lectures series hosted by the Curatorial Studies postgraduate program at Casken Conservatorium in close collaboration with our colleagues of the SMAC Museum in Ghent. This is the 5th year we're pursuing this lecture series, which aims to open up and share the pedagogical context of curatorial education to a wider audience. In the past years, we've invited international curators to reflect upon their practice in relation to specific themes which have ranged from the prompts working with artists to working with collections to working with space. But this year we decided to let go of the relational prompt working with in order to return to the perhaps more invisible curatorial strategies that go beyond art and exhibition making and might be implemented to have an impact elsewhere too. This year's series is about how curating can go beyond the guardianship of objects and cultural heritage and how it can affect and change ourselves, our colleagues, our collaborators, and our audiences within and beyond institutions. The basic prompt addressed to our guests has thus become, how can curating contribute to the kind of art world you want to see? Upcoming lectures will be given by Simon Yami, who will be physically present at SMAC next Thursday, and by Jolanda Zola-Zoli van der Heijden and Cedric Volk, who will join us in the spring. In the slipstream of yesterday's announcements that this year's Turner Prize goes to the Array Collective, a group of artists in Belfast, it's a great pleasure to welcome one of the Turner Prize jury members, Chisenhale director, Dr. Zoé Whitley, who kindly accepted our invitation to address curating as a form of institutional leadership. Rather than having a classic lecture though, we last minute opted to go for a shorter introduction, followed by a more conversational format, where you also, as the audience, are invited to ask any questions you might have related to the idea of curating as a nexus of change, or how institutional leadership can impact the way we work and present art. So I give the word to Zoe, who will do a short intro, and then we take it from there. Thank you so much, Zoe, for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Laura, for having me. I'm pleased to be here. So good evening to everyone who's joining from Belgium or from the UK, but also good morning or good afternoon if people are joining otherwise. I think if Zoom's taught us anything, it's such a wonderful tool for us to be able to all be together in ways that have otherwise been rendered impossible or incredibly difficult over these last 2 years. I wish I'd been able to be in Belgium in person, but I think it does afford other opportunities. I think one of the things it does is to help us constantly rethink the notion of the structures that we put in place or that we follow. So a lecture delivered at a lectern where someone who is an authority or an expert is speaking at you for a period of time, like this hour. And so again, in thinking about even the subject matter of this talk that I'd proposed and this notion of leadership and what that means to effectively kind of be working with and for other people, but not necessarily having to do that from the front, but to think about other ways of doing it. I am hoping that we can use the discursive elements that this tool allows so that people can ask questions if they have them, and so that those of you who have opted to join in are getting what you want out of this hour, and hopefully in a way that's a little bit more tailored to information that you might otherwise find online, because otherwise I feel that I'm giving a very similar talk to ones that I've given before. But that said, I am very honored to be here, and what I will do is share my screen and run through effectively a brief history of my working practice. So hopefully you're all able to see this, which is an image of Chisenhale Gallery on Chisenhale Road. So I am very fortunate to be director of a nonprofit art space in East London, one that you may well be familiar with because it has had a really phenomenal history, and one that I think is rooted in its founding. So the warehouse building that you see here, even with some of the windows still boarded up, is a former veneer factory and brewery warehouse. And when artists were being displaced from their artist studio space in central London along the Thames, they looked east, and east of London was not the kind of cool and happening and incredibly gentrified place that we know it to be today. But the affordable rents meant that artists were able to, in the same way that artists in the 1960s in New York City, say, were able to find these vacant in buildings that had previously been used for industry in order to turn them into workspaces and also exhibiting spaces. So under this one roof today, there is Chisenhale Dance Space, this purple door that you see there. There are more than 30 artist studios in these glass windows on the floors above. And then there is also Chisenhale Gallery on the ground floor. And over the years, we've shown the kind of seminal exhibitions of past Turner Prize winners, including Helen Martin and also Lubaina Hamid, the first woman to win the Turner Prize, Rachel Rightweed, but also Wolfgang Tillmans and many, many more. I won't go through the whole history, but it is one that is really wonderful. And I think it is wonderful because it's never lost sight of that connectedness to artists, and artists having found this kind of vacant shell and thought, you know, there's possibility within this place. We can turn this into something. And that is what we do at the gallery. With each new commission, we work on a commission basis. So we work with artists to help them develop their ideas and turn that into a new body of work. We sometimes do that as a co-commissioning process with other colleagues, either at other nonprofit making institutions in the UK, but mostly internationally. And then what results then lives in the world in a range of different ways. So it's much more pronounced than just an exhibition making practice, but one that relies on a long incubation period, to perhaps misuse scientific terminology. And in these kind of pandemic times, I know that that's probably not the best word choice, but I think it's important to understand that when we work with an artist, we typically work with them over a 1 to 2 year period. And this is an installation view, not too dissimilar from what you would see in the gallery right at this moment. We're currently showing work by Ryndon Johnson. It's Ryndon Johnson's first UK solo exhibition. Ryndon is an American artist based in Berlin, and this work shows a digital rendering of the Atlantic Ocean, effectively at the midpoint between New York City, where our co-commissioners are based, Sculpture Center, and London. And when Ryndon was thinking geographically about this co-commissioning partnership and what it might yield, what resulted was pretty phenomenally this point on the map where the North Atlantic cold blob exists. And this is an area of ocean surface that is kind of resolutely cooler than the surrounding waters that are warming because of the climate crisis. And so this is a portrait that shows kind of minute per minute in time footage of the year before. So for instance, it was snowing in the gallery today, but you have these really stunning vantage points of both the ocean surface and then also these various vantage points that include the horizon line. Equally, there's another sculpture of Ryndon's, Coeval Proposition number 1, the Transamerica building that we've installed on the Hartford Union Canal, which is the body of water that runs immediately along the back of the gallery. And I guess I say that just to frame what it is and where I am right now, but then thought that we would move effectively kind of back in time to some previous exhibitions. This is a work by Tao Wen Fan. So this is the exhibition that was on at Chisenhale Gallery this time last year. So with each exhibition, we kind of drastically transform the space and its potential. And the fact that we work with painters and sculptors and filmmakers and installation artists means that what can happen in the gallery can morph from a performance to a multi-channel film to something that is incredibly immersive for those who enter into it. And those of you who are able to come to London, I'd certainly welcome you in the gallery. We'd be happy to have you there. Prior to working at Chisenhale, I was an institutional curator in museum settings. So rather than working in a context where I was solely producing and commissioning new works of art, I was working with 19th, 20th, and 21st century collections, and really starting to get my head around the notion of artists as kind of not just names that you see in an art history book, but individuals with thoughts and ideas and positions that you might be able to work alongside. And in so doing, working in collections where artworks are not only displayed, but also collected and held in perpetuity for a national collection is also its own, I think, incredibly rich and valuable means of understanding how artworks can represent a culture, kind of teach us things, shine a light back on who we think we are, kind of pose questions and kind of undermine that in some really generative ways as well. And so moving back in time, the project that I'm probably best known for was co-curating an exhibition at Tate Modern in 2017 called Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power. And artists such as Barclay Hendricks, whose work What's Going On you see here, were included in an exhibition that I think broke new ground, not only for having taken a subject matter that was absolutely part of the museum's mission to look at international, modern, and contemporary art, and to do that through the lens of North American art, which is something that had happened in many different forms. And yet the artists included in this exhibition, really bar one, Andy Warhol, and then I suppose maybe to a lesser degree, Sam Gilliam or Frank Bowling, hadn't really had any of their work seen in a UK context to a substantial degree. And it ended up being an opportunity for people to fundamentally rethink what they thought they knew and understood about post-war American art, which is an area that is otherwise incredibly well researched and well understood within a context like Tate Modern. So Britain's National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. But to do that in a manner that all of a sudden felt like, it wasn't sudden at all, it took many years, but that for audiences felt like suddenly there was a much wider acknowledgement of who gets to be an artist, of what an institutional welcome might look like, how you frame discourses that hadn't previously been told. I think the word that feels so overused today in our kind of curatorial lexicon is overlooked, but that always presumes like who's being overlooked and who's doing the overlooking. It can make it quite a passive experience rather than something active that then through curating can also be its own form of doing, of thinking in a way that takes an argument and takes ideas and spatializes them or presents them verbally through talks and events, but that creates a new realm through which people can understand something fundamental about culture. This was an exhibition that was a real labor of love for me and my co-curator Mark Godfrey, but I think it was an incredibly important project because it, in a context like Tate Modern that is as highly visible as it is and that attracts so many audience members, what it does is allow people to begin to unpack what we don't know or what we assume to be the limits of other people's knowledge. And maybe that's fundamentally one of the things that I want to either leave you with today or for us to talk about when we open up to questions is this notion of leadership is something that's fully formed and fully sealed rather than something that grows and evolves. And I think that expertise is very much in that same realm, that we become experts or we understand expertise to be a set of things that you know, and this kind of incontrovertible proof. But I feel like particularly in the art world, what often happens is that that can also be a tool to kind of lock things out and limit experiences. So on the basis that one hasn't heard of someone, that becomes a reason why perhaps they're not worth hearing about or learning about. And rather than thinking like that, I'm much more interested in approaching expertise in an open and continuous manner where you don't know about something because you don't know about something, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn, and that we find these kind of generative ways to not be threatened by what we don't know, but to be willing to constantly learn. And that doesn't mean that we can't seek mastery or expertise in some areas, but to know that that isn't a finite thing. And I think that's very much been an approach for me in thinking through how an exhibition, even an exhibition like Soul of a Nation, with 67 artists, is telling a story. It's not telling the story, even if our aim is to tell that story in as dynamic and enveloping way as possible. In this room, for instance, we have in the foreground a work by Martin Puryear called Self. We have this work in chain link and barbed wire by Melvin Edwards. On the far wall behind, if you can see my arrow pointing, we have Carousel Change by Sam Gilliam. And then on this wall, we have a stunning painting by Frank Bowling called Texas Louise. And the way in which each of these artists is thinking through the possibilities that exist within abstraction in these very different registers is something that you can feel and understand just through looking and being in the room without necessarily having to read the label. So the artist's own discussions and debates and discourses in the art press at the time and over drinks at the bar is something that could somehow then be synergized in this one space and then opened up in a different way through catalog essays and artist talks and documentary videos that exist also from this project. And so thinking also about the ways in which an exhibition doesn't have to be the end result. It can be part of an ongoing process or something that too can evolve over time, I think is something that feels like a useful way to open up a format that we may think of as being quite fixed. Here we have one of the Tate shots, a short video that was made, and that's me in the denim dress, standing with a group of year 4 students, talking to them about Romare Bearden's collages and what resulted from the collages or what they're standing in front of. So these are works called projections. So they were used by making use of the technology at the time, which is a kind of precursor to the photocopier, and thereby being able to enlarge images, to take really the stuff of our everyday lives from magazines. So this would have been Life magazine or African American specialist press like Ebony or Jet or the Saturday Evening Post, and then using those to kind of put together this kind of incredibly rich and complex picture of a composite identity of an American street. And that to me not only felt so vital, but I think it also spoke to an internationalism and an understanding that Bearden in particular had of not only the whole arc of art history, from the kind of foundations of collage first being made by Picasso and Braque, and maybe others who are unnamed, and thinking through what it might mean to hold in equal weight the Harlem of a Netherlandish painter and the North American Harlem in which Bearden lived and worked. And so this way of not necessarily even having to choose between privileging one experience over the other, but knowing that, the synergies that can happen through thinking through them both in a complex way is something that yields nuance and innovation and new approaches. So that to me has always been something that has been important, and equally an understanding that when you're making an exhibition, even if you're saying in an ideal world, I want everyone to come, you're speaking to someone, maybe there's someone that you would like to come or who would like to connect with it. And with this exhibition in particular, it felt so important to address young Londoners. I mean, these are very young Londoners, but to understand that for a multicultural society, that there is a place for you within culture, that culture isn't something that exists over there for someone else, that you are part of making it, of interpreting it, of understanding it. And I think that this exhibition in particular gave a lot of people that latitude to see work that they hadn't previously seen, but also to ask questions about it, to come together and talk about it. And it's those sorts of things, what might the exhibition or the curatorial work make possible, that I think is an interesting question to ask. And I don't think there's a single answer to it. I think there are many answers to it. Here's an image of Frank Bowling in front of his painting Middle Passage. And at the time of the Soul of a Nation exhibition, it had been more than 3 decades since Frank Bowling had seen the painting. So it was on loan from the Menil collection in Houston. That's just a little bit of an aside, but I think it does something important, because I would like all of you who are listening and are either doing this work or would like to do it. I think it was a revelation to me when I started working in museums, that artists were people that you could talk to and address your questions to, in addition to having read about them. And I think through my relationship with Frank Bowling and his family, I think that's what led to this children's book, Meet the Artist Frank Bowling, because he has such a singular take on color and such an innovative approach to abstraction, not just once, but many, many times over the, well, now 7, almost 8 decades of his career. And so in thinking through that body of work, and how often children through making are able to understand the complexities of abstraction, or of just improvising with materials in a way that an activity book makes possible. It was certainly a lot more fun for me than writing a theory book, which I don't think I have in me. This is another project that I really enjoyed working on. It was an Afrofuturism exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2013. It was called The Shadows Took Shape. So here we have a work by Derek Adams. We also have works by Lily Reynaud-Douar. It was a very international presentation. Also Trenton Doyle Hancock, Harold Offey, Sanford Biggers, This Quilt on the Wall, and many others besides. But it was interesting because sometimes, even in the process of making an exhibition, you don't know what impact it might then have later on. So there's currently a wonderful period room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that's been curated by Hannah Beachler, the Oscar-winning designer of the Black Panther film. And she's created a Seneca Village period room, but recomposed through an Afrofuturist lens. And this exhibition was one of the touchstones for that project. And this exhibition, The Shadows Took Shape, I co-curated with a friend and colleague named Naima Keith. Here we have a work at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I was a curator for 10 years, from, that would have been 2003 until 2013, by an artist from Benin. His name is Romuald Hazume. And so this work was a site-specific commission. He made an Ouroboros, so the symbol of the serpent swallowing its own tail, and a symbol of eternity, something that's infinite, in jerry cans. So his signature material is the plastic jerry can, which he uses because of its anthropomorphic qualities, the ways in which the molded plastic can look like a handlebar mustache or the nose bridge, and the way that the handle can be a nose, or the opening where one would either pour materials into or out of. It's like the aperture of a mouth, became something that is an important unit that he's able to use not only as single masks, but also in these kind of monumental works. So this is in the John Medeski Garden at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where it was on view in 2007, during the year of Britain's bicentenary of the transatlantic slave trade. And this work is now in the collection of the Smithsonian African Art Museum. There's another view of it with children climbing on the plinth and people kind of deciding what they would do with the artwork and how they would interact with it. Here's another work that I'd commissioned during my time at the Victoria and Albert Museum in the Norfolk House Music Room by the artist Yinka Shonibare. And it's a work called Sir Foster Cunliffe Playing. I see that there's a question in the chat, so I'll move swiftly on. This is but one tiny sliver of a 100-piece work by Lubaina Hamid, called Naming the Money. So these are two drummers and a map maker, among a number of different figures who each have a particular profession. And then they are sculptures designed to be experienced recto verso. So even though they are, fundamentally what appears to be two-dimensional, then on the back you have not only the name of the individual, but something of their story. And importantly, each of these figures are representing enslaved people. So they have both the name that they are called or referred to in their enslaved condition, and then equally what their passions, what their dreams are, what they were named by their own people. And it's an incredibly affirming work, particularly when you're able to see them all in en masse as one kind of very powerful chorus of voices. This might seem very different from some of the works that I'm associated with curating, but I think the important thing is that it's artists that drive the work and that I'm interested in learning from. And this was an almost 3-ton book in lead by the artist Anselm Kiefer called The Secret Life of Plants, that was also commissioned for an artist's book exhibition that took place at the V&A in 2009. This, some of you may recognize, is the exterior of the British Pavilion in the Giardini or gardens in Venice, where the Venice Biennale takes place. And the Venice Biennale is an event that, as the name implies, is biannual. So it happens every other year. Because of COVID, the next one has been displaced and is happening in 2022. So will be happening next April through to the end of the year. But it is structured in part as national pavilions. And in 2019, I had the honor of curating the British Pavilion, working with an artist who was born and raised in Belfast and is currently based in Glasgow, Scotland, named Cathy Wilkes. So this is an installation view from the first room of her work. And there's so much to say about Cathy's work, but even more to feel or to intuit when you're there with it. So I will just keep it brief by saying that there were both a combination of paintings and sculptures, most of which Cathy made on site. Venice has a very particular light, as many poets and writers have kind of waxed lyrical about over the centuries. And so in this case, these paintings on linen were started in Glasgow and then were adjusted to the particular light quality of Venice upon arrival. So just witnessing Cathy's making process and seeing how, to put it as concisely as possible, the way that her practice thinking like a sculptor comes into how she approaches the materials for painting, and then how she composes the arrangements of the sculptures very much like a painter, so that you have these degrees of tonal difference between this kind of deeper mustard colored yellow, almost an ochre, and this sherberty lemon yellow, and this kind of diaphanous white. It's a wonderful process, and I think people were very moved by the work. But because Cathy is an artist who doesn't want curatorial speak or interpretation to get in the way of the work, there's something very interesting here about the expectations of how we behave in space, and about how off-putting it can feel to not be given a label or something to read and mediate, because excuse me, the artist, in this case Cathy, really wants to trust the person who comes into this space to be able to form their own opinion. And it's interesting how much some of the conventions of our curatorial practice can actually become something that can hamper that process. You know, don't know how many people listening in might have experienced going to an exhibition, and before you even look at the work, you begin to read the label. And certainly Cathy's an artist for whom that isn't something that should hamper the process of, even in not knowing, of wanting to interrogate the work and get close to it, to develop some thoughts for yourself. Here's another view in one of the other rooms, one of the sculptures, kind of in relation to one of the paintings. There's just an image of one of Cathy's color etchings, which she also made as part of the suite of works that were displayed then. I'm just aware of time, and we're already halfway through, so I might stop the share, and then we can see how we go with questions.
I see two questions, Anna-Julie Arnfred and Anton Lacroce. I will give you the word. I hope that's okay. Maybe start with Anna-Julie. You can ask your question if you want to. If you prefer not to, I can also read it out.
No, it's fine. I'm not sure I can see the question myself in the Q&A. So, well, I can try to reframe it or rephrase it. Yeah, I was just thinking of, now you're talking about both the invisible curatorial strategies, but also I was thinking this about around then from your talk also how you look at this, about how you to work with them. Or maybe you should just read the question aloud, but how to work with the curating as a relational practice. I mean, you're used to working as curators with relational practices in a space, but taking that from the objects or the artworks or the artifacts, and taking that practice and as a work, as you also mentioned before, like the invisible caretaking or translating and mediation and weaving, there is part of the curatorial curating process, and how to use that outside the gallery or the exhibition space or the art world. as a facilitator of processes. And
Yeah.
I was just thinking a bit, because now you talked about the exhibitions, but also in your talk, I sense something about that. So I was wondering your opinions about that, or your views on it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Anne Julie. I think I have a lot of opinions on that. And really, your question sums up for me a lot of what I was just talking about last night when the Turner Prize was announced, because for me, every part of this process and of the work I do, because I work with living artists, is about the artists and relates fundamentally back to the artists and wanting to connect their ideas and perspectives with other people. And what I think was so vital, and in a way that's fundamental and in a manner that I wasn't able to comprehend before the pandemic, is that, you know, artists make work in so many different contexts. I think we are taught and we internalize some very narrow views of who an artist is, who gets to be an artist, which I guess is part of my curatorial practice in hoping to open that up in some ways. But I think more than that, it's also about where art is shown. And so throughout the successive lockdowns, and in the UK, there have been 3 lengthy ones, during that time, museums and galleries couldn't open to the public, and nonprofit museums and galleries, such as the one I run, but certainly larger ones as well, because we weren't part of the retail or what was thought to be a kind of economic benefit, actually opened a month later than the commercial galleries in this country anyway. So commercial galleries were able to reopen as non-essential retail from, if memory serves, something like the 12th of April this year, whereas nonprofit galleries and museums had to wait an additional month. So we weren't able to open until mid-May. And that doesn't mean that in that time that certainly artists were having to deal with many difficult setbacks of exhibitions not taking place or being canceled, but certainly artists don't stop making work because of a museum or gallery not being able to open its doors. And so the big motivation behind how, for instance, my fellow jurors and I came up with the short list of the nominees for this year's Turner Prize precisely had to do with a dearth, or, you know, a complete impossibility of being able to see art in public spaces, but the absolute joy and possibility and wonder of how many artists were impacting their communities in brilliantly creative, original ways that had nothing to do with, you know, sitting in a dark viewing room or putting a sculpture on a plinth. And that way of thinking about the whole scope of how artists give so much to the communities that they're a part of, and not only through making work that might garner headlines because of setting an auction record or something like that, is to me what feels so exciting and interesting, or it's what constantly, I guess, propels the work I do and the questions that I ask, because, you know, I'm fascinated by that process of being able to be a human being that conjures an idea and then makes it real, or brings other people into it and says, why don't we try doing this? That process of making and doing, and yeah, imagining and believing, and the ways that can take shape, not just in physical form, but, you know, through conversations and meals and other things, I think also helps us expand what constitutes not just art, but I think what we are willing to call culture generally, and to really begin to accept and acknowledge that there are many, many rich cultures that are deserving of our time and attention, or that we may also be contributing to, and we just haven't given ourselves the time or the credit to think about it in those terms.
Thank you.
You can go to Antonella Croci if you're fine with speaking.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a poor connection, so I'm not going to use the video. But I was really excited for this webinar. As you said, Zoe, it's really exciting to be able to connect, even though we're quite far away. And unfortunately, I left London in 2020 just before seeing you actually run in the place. So I'm you work at the Tate, but not since you started your role. I was quite interested in what you said about, at the end of the day, the fact that you discovered as a young curator when you started that you were able to talk to artists, and really at the end of the day, that's what really interested you. I think that's what you were saying. Which I think is brilliant. It should be the motivation for all of us. If you're a director, a curator, a registrar, whatever you are, but that's at the end of the day what motivates you, maybe. But sometimes don't you feel like there is a paradox there, where it's sometimes easier to talk to artists and not so easy to talk to curators, such as maybe you're starting off your career and it would be really helpful to talk to a professional like yourself, who is, you know, who has a lot more knowledge and experience. But sometimes I feel like there is a gap over there, and it's not so easy. Do you work in that direction? I know that you're extremely busy, but do you feel like it's something that makes sense to you?
Yeah, I think I just want to make sure I understand the question. Do you mean access? Do you mean other arts workers having access to curators, or do you mean other arts workers having access to artists?
Yeah, for instance, I did a master in curating in Paris, and I didn't have the chance to talk to so many curators like they're doing at Cask, for instance. And I feel that at that point, it would have been really helpful to be able to talk to a person like yourself, who's closer to my ideas and what I hope that my future could be. And sometimes it's really not easy to be in touch with someone like yourself and just share some ideas. So simply as that, not as a tutor, but maybe something like that.
Yeah, I guess maybe that says something about well, the professionalization or even hyper professionalization of the role of curator, certainly in institutional contexts where, you know, that didn't necessarily exist until, you know, more recent times. I don't mean museum curators per se, but I mean individuals that are kind of authoring projects and collaborating with artists. You know, it's something that we think of as kind of having a genesis in the 60s in a certain sense, but maybe it also says something about what else curators can learn from artists, because not that any system is faultless, but having worked with Ryndon Johnson, so the North Atlantic Ocean that I showed in the first slide, well, the second slide, but Ryndon is an artist who really enjoys the process of the crit, you know, that kind of artist critique that happens in a way that's designed to be observational and supportive and open-ended rather than kind of critical and attacking. And I think it's interesting to think that actually in the way that artists who are studying in certain art college contexts have the benefit of learning as much from each other as from their tutors, that perhaps there's something like that style of learning, because also in those contexts you might have more established artists kind of come in to offer those critiques, to offer those crits, and to be part of that space and to share research. And that as a model could be something that certainly could be useful on curating courses and other things. But I think that certainly many of the curators that I know, yeah, I guess we make some effort to try and be accessible or to reach out. But yeah, I think that's I think that is the difficult thing. You don't necessarily know who wants to reach you or talk to you. But I think that in other ways, you know, social media and other things help connect people. But I also, to my point about like expertise, I think that when I look at individuals or kind of cohorts who inspire me, like the relationship between, say, Lorna Simpson and Glenn Ligon and Thelma Golden, and the way they're so creatively and otherwise supportive of one another, that I think I would also say that in being part of, you know, the next generation of curators, that those of us who are doing it now will be learning from you, and you'll be doing things in a different way. So I think that establishing that kind of trusted peer network for that kind of critical engagement is probably just as, or if not more important.
Thank you.
Samuel also has a question.
Yes, hello, hi. I'll also stay off camera, but thank you very much for your presentation and insight in your recent curatorial practice. My question related to the dominance. Well, first of all, I would hope you would agree to the assessment of the dominance of US perspectives relating to Blackness or Afro-American critical theory regarding representation or matters of decolonization. And as a US citizen working outside of the US, I'd be interested on your kind of evaluation of that dominance outside of the US and how you relate to it. In the Soul of a Nation, you very precisely pointed out that this was a North American perspective, and I think that's very important indeed to highlight or to emphasize that regionality of the narrative. So I'm curious how you would relate to that dominance, especially, for example, in Belgium, which has a completely different relation to colonial history compared to the UK or the US.
Well, I think of a Dutch artist like Iris Kensmil, who I had the pleasure of meeting because she represented Netherlands in 2019, the same year I was in Venice a lot. I think that if we also think about artists like Grada Quilomba, who are part of a very interesting and really trenchant group of thinkers and makers in an Afro-German context, I think that it is important to constantly question both the dominance of the English language fundamentally in the circulation of ideas around art and culture, English being the lingua franca of the art world, for instance, or, you know, the kind of contemporary art world that there are art worlds plural, of course, but it's something that I'm very, very aware of. I was speaking about it with a colleague, Madani Yunus, who's the creative director of The Shed in New York now, but had previously been based in the UK and identifies as Asian British. I think that the more that we are able to think through a whole range of references and practices, and certainly in the context of a number of the projects that I've spoken about. So say in relation to Hazume or Lubena Hamid, that the reference points for any kind of wider art historical or curatorial context would not come solely from North America. And I think that there's an importance in doing that. I don't know that, I think that there's a certain visibility to certain really excellent ideas now, and that's partly why they have the traction that they do, whether it's Fred Moten or, you know, there's so many people I could think of who are doing excellent work. So I think that the excellence is there, but in other international contexts, there are a number of things to think about, and to actually, in even posing your question, I think that's where part of the answer lies, is that not having that be the default, or in your own practice, in your own work, being willing to share other reference points so that there is a kind of a different network. Because again, I think we can think about these different visibilities and try to, not necessarily having to think of them as a hegemonic structure, or somehow a value judgment where the most visible is necessarily the most applicable. And so thinking through precisely those questions where, okay, well, if this is the default, then actually where else might we go with it? So I think that it's in asking that question and kind of pushing that forward that something really interesting happens, because I think that African-American critical race theory is fundamental for addressing African-American contexts. And I think that many people have looked at that to not only understand where they might take it in other contexts, but to also say, this is a model that is useful to me. And so I think that I am always interested in the both and rather than the either or, not to put something aside and to replace it with something else, but to precisely ask this question, well, if this is the only thing we're looking at, then why? Are there other ways to do it? So I think that, you know, in your context, if there are other kind of Belgian thinkers that you'd really want to bring to the fore, or to be thinking through a very context-specific nexus, then that is an important thing to be borne in mind, so that there's not the kind of default that could happen, you know, potentially on a curating course where the bibliography starts to kind of trend one way when it could actually be drawing from more and different references.
Thank you very much.
Jessica, do you want to go?
Yes. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I want to ask something in the talk you mentioned before, being working in the gallery, that you were working as an institutional curator. So I would like to ask, what do you see as the difference between working as a curator inside of a gallery, as a non-profit gallery or gallery in general, and working in an institution like a museum, if there are any differences, and if the museum as an institution maybe has certain limits in the relation between art and people, and having an impact on going beyond the institution itself.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jessica. Scale is the biggest difference, because I've never worked in a commercial gallery. So I've always worked in the nonprofit visual arts sector. And in doing so, the first 10 years of my career were at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So that's Britain's National Art and Design Museum, or National Decorative Arts Museum, as was. And then at Tate for just about 6. And for a summer when I was an undergraduate at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which is my local, the local large museum in the city that I grew up in. And I think that the scale and infrastructure is something that is so different. You know, in an organization of 10 people, if 4 people are ill, your work staff is down 40%, even if you're not good at maths, then, you know, it's drastic. And clearly in an organization of, you know, 600 or 800, those types of things you feel differently. So the level of specialization is different in terms of what's defined as your role, as opposed to, you know, calling someone to, I don't know, get the fridge fixed or something like that. And there is, so I think that that sense of having a very elastic and adaptable role is different in any smaller institution. But I think that I do love museums and think that there are wonderful possibilities within them. You know, for instance, having for most of my life lived places where there were museums that were free to access, and what that fundamentally means as a route to an equitable share of culture. And we know that that doesn't always or often happen in practice, but as a principle, I think it is an interesting place to start. So I try and start not from the limits. And again, I think that there are colleagues who I admire so much that, you know, are all about the kind of change from the outside and kind of dismantling the institution. And then there are those of us whose personalities or whatever, or I guess, are better suited to, you know, doing our best to create some change from within, but equally to understand structures that work. I mean, certainly in a museum context in the before times, before 2 years ago, I think you also have the scale of how many people you can reach. You know, that a very small event might bring 250 people together to watch the screening of an artist's film, and what that means for the artist to be able to engage in that room. And certainly a museum exhibition on a larger scale, the tens or even hundreds of thousands, in the case of, you know, the largest museums, what that represents for an artist's work to be better seen and understood is really seismic, and, you know, makes a huge difference. So I don't think that one is better than the other. I think they're just so different.
Thank you very much for your answer.
There's 2 more questions, I think. Maybe.
Okay.
Are you still okay with answering?
Yeah, I think we're nearly out of time, but let's take these final 2.
Okay. Johannes?
I can read it out. Johannes has asked a kind of hybrid questions or series of questions. What do you like more, artist texts or artist talks? I definitely like talking. I definitely like to listen to artists. So artist talks are great. Who is the public art have today? I'm not sure I understand the question if Johannes is still here. What kind of public is not coming to see art? Can education do more to tackle this? I think that's always the question. I think it is a question that just has to perpetually be asked. When I started working in museums in 2003, the constant refrain was, you know, what we do is for everyone, but there was no interrogation of, well, everyone isn't here, who isn't here? Or if an institution can't be all things to all people, then who are you trying to address? You know, there are times when we have to be specific. You know, if this is a hands-on making workshop by a young and relatable sculptor who wants to work with teenagers, then you're creating a specific context. And so it's important to have the who. I think that the way that many of us are educated, it does presuppose a knowledge that you need to speak about art and to understand it, to, even if the doors are open and there's no price of admission. There have been, you know, countless important research texts and kind of active qualitative research and quantitative as well around the notion of threshold fear. You know, who feels that they can't go beyond the threshold? But it's not always even about fear. You know, what if it's, I don't want to be in that place? That isn't a place that's ever shown me that it was doing something that was relevant or interesting to the kind of cultures or things I engage in. So I think education can do more to tackle it, but I think those of us who are lucky enough to do this work can also think differently about how we make a welcome, where we advertise the things that we're doing, how we communicate that. And that doesn't mean we'll always get it right, far from, but I think it's in the attempt. And that's certainly been part of, say, the journey with Soul of a Nation. So much of what felt like such a sea change was that the audience was very, very different, certainly younger and far more ethnically diverse in terms of like the actual makeup of what the City of London looks like and is. And that happened not accidentally, but through very intentional, different strategies in terms of where it was advertised, not just advertising on the tube, because of course, some people can't afford the tube, but are you also advertising on bus shelters? Are you thinking about who might be of interest to them in terms of speakers? And when I say them, I'm thinking of like young teenagers. And so me as a middle-aged woman is probably not best placed to judge. So can you speak to another younger maker who might be able to then tap into an audience that would then become more interested in this older generation of artists? I think there are a number of those kind of strategies that are interesting. The question's gone. I think there was a third part to it, but I hope that's helpful. I'm gonna have to go shortly because of my childcare situation. So unfortunately, there's more questions being added, but I do need for these to be the last ones. Someone was asking about my experience of the Future Generation Art Prize Selection Committee. I enjoyed it hugely. I don't know that I've ever learned so much. It was a very big commitment because it is the largest open call of its kind. And so there were hundreds of applications for us to go through and to spend time with. And the jury took place not in Kiev as we'd hoped. I mean, not jury, but the selection, I should say panel. Sorry, jury, I have Turner Prize on the brain. I am not doing the selecting of the Future Gen Art Prize winners. I think that there was very, very much a commitment from each of us on the selection committee to take care and to listen to one another, and those who were able to give insights into different international contexts, again, to come back to Samuel's comment and question earlier. And yes, you're right, the number of applications is enormous. And I think that is a good thing and a generative thing because of what happens as a result. And artists and collectives from very different contexts apply. How do you as a professional build your strategy in such cases? I think it's mainly what I'd said is through not having any foregone conclusions, and in listening and talking with the other colleagues so that the list that results is hopefully geographically fair, that represents a whole host of practices. I don't think you'll see a list that is, say, all French painters. The notion of thinking through a whole range of practices that really cover the length and breadth and really truly dynamic and eclectic makeup of what it means to make work is something that was important. So now I've been asked, the Turner Prize consisted of only activist art groups, which has never happened before, if I understand correctly. I don't know that all of them think of themselves as activists. They are artists. This raises questions referring to the article in the art newspaper, such as whether the future of British art belongs in a gallery or museum. How do you deal with it as a director of a gallery? Is this a concept that was also alive during the selection of the winner? I think that this is, again, I guess I'm never interested in something being in one place or being in another place. For those of you, and maybe no one who's participating has been able to see the exhibition in Coventry, but it was curated by Hamid Nasser, and it's so coherent and interesting to experience as an exhibition, as a punter. And I think that these questions about, well, how can this work possibly live in the gallery? When it's able to do that, but it's also to bring the galleries alive in a way that they hadn't previously been. The director of the Herbert Museum said that a 4-year-old attended the other day and said he'd heard about the Turner Prize and wanted to see it, and left saying that he was going to be nominated one day and that he was going to win the Turner Prize. So some of it is just about changing what we think museums and galleries can be or do. The fact that Array Collective created a shebeen, among other things, that's only one part of their presentation. There's also a kind of a monument come Druid circle of empty flagpoles. That's a kind of very powerful comment on nationhood. But the way that Project Artworks artists were in the gallery making every day, and that they brought their archive to the space, the way that Gentle Radical recorded films and had written letters to one another so that you have these insights into perspectives, all of that's happening in the gallery. So it's possible. It doesn't have to be that something only happens on the street or only happens in a church hall, and that a gallery is somehow not fit for purpose. I think what we have to understand is that the purpose that galleries can serve can change and will keep changing, and they will actually change because artists and audiences will tell us that they need to change and have to change. And so I think that to me is a great thing, to see how it can evolve, rather than saying art has to behave this way in order to be in this space. Actually, maybe the space can behave differently to accommodate different artists. So Lilith, I guess, is the final one.
I think it's a way to connect to you.
Oh, okay.
So maybe we can end it here.
Okay.
And so you can run to your child.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you so much for your generosity of joining us. And yeah, good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.